Hello, good evening, good afternoon, good morning, and welcome to this Virtuoso Thought Leadership webinar. I almost mispronounced that. Virtuoso Thought Leadership webinar. Have you got a data problem with your test automation? My name is Ryan Thornton. I am head of product marketing, VP of marketing, something to do with marketing, but somebody who loves product. And I will be your master of ceremonies, taking you through the next 30 minutes or so in this test automation webinar. I will be aided and abetted by my able partner in test, Mr. James Bent. Still can't take a cue. Hello, James.
Hello, Ryan. Good to be back for another webinar. I do like these thought leadership ones where we'd really, addressing some of the hot topics of the day. And this one, I'm really looking forward to test data and how you can really, resolve issues around that. It's going to be a super one.
I'll let the audience be the judge of that, but always nice to see confidence. No one has mentioned this yet, which is unusual. The webinar will be being recorded and will wing its way to you by email, so you can watch at your leisure on demand. We are indeed talking about data, the one of the two horsemen of the apocalypse when it comes to test automation implementation failing. And we say it's a hot topic, and indeed James is right, but it's been a hot topic for almost as long as I can remember, that together with the second horseman being environments. So what are we going to talk about today? We'll get an introduction to what we mean by test data, and then look through validating, generating, introducing, and deleting test data in a scripted but low code approach. We're going to be a little bit agnostic towards tools until the end. Then we'll show how we do it with Virtuoso. But what we're saying here will apply to pretty much anything that you're doing, and looks to kind of establish best practice when working with data. And then looking at an API approach, demonstration, and if you've still got time at the end, we'll have a Q&A session where you can ask us anything regarding test automation and test data. So there are three main areas that we're going to have a look at here. And we will kind of show like your classic easy stuff with CSV files and how to run a series of tests based upon rows, either in isolation or in parallel. But at you kind of 20,000 feet, to introduce you where we are, we're looking at the introduction of data into the system under test, then testing the functionality with the data, and removing the data from the system under test. Now, people get very excited, I think, and we're going to start data driving our tests, and that means that there is oft a focus on that middle section, the validate. But you will see, and we'll discuss why kind of focusing there and not looking to having a data creation strategy and a data cleanup strategy. The validate bit is probably, not all things are built equally, and for some tests it will work. For some systems and applications under tests it will work, but for the majority of cases you're going to be giving yourself a headache. And have you got a data problem? One of the giveaways, not always, again, there's different reasons for different things, and this is complex, but if you've got a lot of ifs and thens in your test scripts, that might be an indication that you do have a test data problem. So to begin with, testing is complicated. Your test should be done, but testing itself is complicated. And when we look on the right-hand side of the screen there, we're focusing on this just purely testing the functionality with data. And if the focus is there, tests can start to collide. You know, you can even have a situation as simple as you can't have two users logged in at the same time, which is going to cause your test to fail if run in parallel. And they will fail not because of the functionality of the application to test, but because of the poor data. Again, them not, you know, you're logging in with the same person each time, or you're creating a new account with the same email each time. And teams often come up with clever workarounds, which comes back to that if-then statement. But this will mean that your tests aren't dumb, which they should be. You know, make them as simple as possible. And the way you do that is to admit that you may have a data problem and start to look left and right to your creation and deletion. So data generation itself, I mean, we're always talking in webinars and thought leadership about a perfect world. We all know we don't operate in a perfect world, and what I'm giving you here is kind of that perfect. It may be you don't have access to the database. It may be that you do need to use certain data because of the way in which things are structured and the process that you have. But we should always be thinking to moving towards certainly not using production data for testing. Tools can help, though. We have mostly AI, which we've done a joint webinar with, which create AI generated synthetic data, which has all the characteristics of your production data, but is completely anonymized through an AI. Faker.js, I think James probably, I'm not 100%, will be able to show you how random data can be generated using this clever little tool. And when you're looking at data generation, you need to understand just how much you're going to need, because it could be quite a lot and probably is quite a lot. And your testing environments may not be as secure. So one of the biggest reasons for not using production data is, you know, you don't want to be using personal data of your customers in that less secure environment. Equally, you may need to have different data for different environments. So getting that down before you start your test automation journey is something that we really recommend. And in our previous thought leadership webinar on creating a test automation strategy, we kind of speak to how this must form part of that test automation strategy. So then we move, once you've got that data, you need to introduce it into your tests. So we've got a step-by-step. We use this natural language with Virtuoso, which is interacting with the UI through steps written like a manual test. And all data must be introduced in a step-by-step manner using your test script and interactions with the application under test. And as we said in the previous slide, you know, great sharing in ensuring that the data is fit for purpose and that you've generated the right data, and that you're remembering what your environment is and ensuring that the data is fit for purpose for that environment. You can see on the right hand side of the screen there kind of an example of, you know, getting the username, the password, and the login, all of them used as variables here so that you can put that data in. But what's most important, as any parent of a teenager will tell you, is to clean up after yourself. The data should be cleansed from the system under test by interacting with the UI of the application. So if you've created an account with a username and password, it's obviously an oversimplified example here, you want to make sure you've cleaned up the system under test before you've finished as part of that test as a best practice. Otherwise, next time you run the test, if you use the same data, you're going to have failures because of the fact that it's not going to operate as a new user, let's say. Now, there is another approach that James is going to show you and can help you really speed things up. And that is how you can use APIs to set up your environment, set up your data, delete your data, and leave the system under test as you found it, having validated that the application under test works with that data, works as expected. It's probably a bit more of a show than a tell here on this play. And you have two options, and which is best? You know, do you use the UI, or do you use APIs in conjunction with functional UI testing to have real end-to-end test automation? It depends. Probably a hybrid approach is going to be the best. One where you take a smaller percentage of your test and use the UI and just the UI and interactions to create your end-to-end tests. And these will be the most user-centric because you're doing them exactly like a user would. However, while doing that, you can increase your test coverage, the speed at which you can author and the scale at what you can do by using the APIs to set up the environment and to set up the data. A bit of a whirlwind tour there of kind of the 20,000 feet theory behind it. Some oversimplifications won't always apply to everything because the real world is different from the book world. But I'm hoping that skeleton will be provided with some flesh as James takes over the sharing of the screen.
Thank you very much, Ryan. And yeah, I think this is such an important topic. I mean, we'll show you, in Virtuoso how we address some of these topics. But I think really the bigger theme is actually just getting people thinking around that. Firstly, test data, of course, is an incredibly difficult thing to manage in any form of testing. And therefore, just that thought around how to put in place strategies to start managing that, being able to do that in automation, even better if you did it with Virtuoso, fantastic. But this is really to sort of prompt you to think about, actually, can we be doing things differently and better? So let's jump in and actually show you that then in terms of what do we mean by being able to manage test data when talking about test automation. Firstly, this is Virtuoso that we are showing you. For those of you who aren't familiar with us, we are a test automation platform focusing on functional UI and integration testing of browser-based applications. Here we have Salesforce being a browser-based application. And our approach is enabling people to write tests in natural language. So if I saw there was a login button on the screen, I could just use our natural language syntax, click, and then I could write login based on what I see on the screen. So a little bit like how you'd write manual test scripts. Now that's fantastic. But then of course, throughout tests, I mean, Salesforce is a great example of a data-driven platform. You're entering in accounts, contacts, opportunities, which will include things like account names or account or opportunity type of data. But of course, the first thing you're going to do for, let's say, pretty much a lot of business applications is you're going to log in, which means you're going to use, firstly, a URL to navigate to, a username, a password. These are kind of environment types of variables or environment data. So actually, we'll talk through a number of different ways that you can start managing, because this is test data. Which environment do I want to use? I'm probably going to have different environments. Does that mean I have to create multiple of the same tests if I want to test against a dev or a stage? Do I have to recreate the test if I'm going to log in as different users? You shouldn't have to, because here, as you can see, you can use variables, basically placeholders for data, URL, username, password. And in this case, for test data, these can be held in an environment. So we could see, for example, we have our Salesforce environment where we have defined a username, a password, we have the URL. They're held separate from the test. And I think, from experience of talking with a lot of testers and doing a lot of research, it's pretty good practice to decouple the test from the data, whether the environment or, as we'll see, then the actual data you're entering into the system. So in this way, I could have the environment variables, and then I could choose when I run my test, which environment to run that against. So it's just one example of how you can actually, reduce down the need to duplicate your tests and instead separate out the test data. So in this case, to go into different environments. But then what about, let's say my test might be to go and manage an opportunity in Salesforce. Now, the trouble is, I don't know what opportunities exist for me to go and manage, unless I'm actively in the platform. So what I'm probably going to do is come through and say, well, I'm going to have to create an opportunity, which may also mean, since an opportunity has to relate to an account, I've probably got to also create an account. So as part of my test, my journey, as we call it in Virtuoso, because we're looking at more end-to-end workflows, we have test steps to be able to enter into the account screen, create a new account, which brings me to the account form, and then I start populating all the required information into the various fields. It's going to be data being entered. Now, Ryan mentioned that one strategy could be to utilize tools like Faker. So for instance, in this step, we have generating random details, which is a company name, which is actually leveraging the faker.js library to say, I want to generate a company name, and it creates a unique random company name that's realistic, that is stored then into a variable, which I could then write into the screen, as you can see, as part of my test. So you don't have to predefine this type of data. So when you've got, maybe you need to enter first name, last name, it could be a phone number in UK format or US format. Now that's relatively generic data. So instead of predefining that, I could have a strategy to create random test data as the test is running. It's very useful for that sort of very almost agnostic type of data. So similarly, then I could come through, but then it could be that I say, well, let's drill down here to say, we want to look at, I don't know, a rating, for example. So now ratings in the Salesforce screens are specific. They're going to be, it could be, as we see here, hot, warm, or cold. Now, I can't generate those randomly because they're specific system values. So where could I get those from? And you see here, I have another variable for rating, and that's picking hot. Now, where's that coming from? So in Virtuoso, we have the ability for you to set up test data. So whether you come in and create test data tables, so I could literally define a table and then start populating the names of my variables, I could do that. But equally, I could upload a CSV file and bring in my data, which has the header row as all my variables, as you can see here. So I have my rating. And then I could populate in each of the rows the different scenarios, the different data sets that I want to be able to populate. So with that defined, back in my test, I could then choose to then assign a data table to my test. And then I can use those variables to now, when I put in rating, as I run the test, it will look into the data table. Now, it could be, that even I had 5 scenarios in my test data, I may only want to run my test, let's say, with row 4. So what we then have is the ability to be able to go through and actually define which test data rows I want to run my test with. So I can say, just run it with row 4. Maybe that's, I don't know, a particular type of sale to a particular type of company, and I'm just wanting to test that scenario. It starts to show actually from an orchestration side how you can put in all your test data, but then I can actually pick and choose what I want to run on a particular execution. So that's fantastic. But then we could also do things like, you can see here, I could join data. So I could say, I want to put in a description that joins together. This is a description for, and the name, which pulls in my company name I defined. So I could actually start creating, test data plus putting in, let's say, fixed fields here, because this is a description that I'm writing onto the screen. And, I can sort of join that together. Now, the other thing we can really do here is we can say, as we're running through the test, we might want to store data. So you have dynamically generated data. For instance, here, when we create an opportunity, I might want to store a value, which could be the opportunity ID that Salesforce assigns. I don't know that until the test runs, until I start going through the system. So by being able to store particular values into variables, it means that you can handle the fact that data is generated by the test, or rather the system under test itself. And then you can see I can start using that variable throughout my test, whether it's to write it in a field, or it could be to come and then search for that when maybe I finish creating the opportunity. So what this really shows, it's a strategy to be able to, in the UI, I can have test steps to be able to create my data, whether it's using environment data, test data, or random data, as we saw, to set up my tests. Now, as Ryan mentioned, as part of that, really, then you can have assertions. As part of this, you can validate the data. So we can use sort of these assertions to be able to look for data, or it could be to assert that data meets expected values. So we can also use our data to, look for the presence for it, or it could be to assert that particular data values meet what I have in my test data. So this is really about being able to set up data, create, then use the data in my test. But then, of course, at the end of this, I may want to come in and say, well, I don't want to fill my, in this case, Salesforce up with hundreds and hundreds of opportunities. What I want to do is make sure at the end of my test, once I've finished, if I have a need to be able to clean that down, then I could write test steps in this case to come in, open that opportunity based on the variable that we saved. So search for it, and then go through steps to be able to emulate how a user would come in, and in this case, open up the capability to be able to delete that. So we can go through and follow through in the UI steps to clean that data up. So first I'm going to delete the opportunity, then I could come and search for the account name, and then similarly come in and delete that. So it's basically sort of almost how you would do this if you took a manual approach to doing this. Now that's fine, and it's really quick and easy to do this. Literally, if I just really quickly sort of show you with Virtuoso, just to give a quick view of how this works. When we say we're using natural language, we enable you to come in, and let's say if I want to do my login steps, then I can literally come in and let's say write my username, which is going to come from the environment. I look at the screen and it says username. I haven't had to predefine that username as an object. We're looking for it using bots to identify that and write in the screen. So you can see how immediately I can start writing tests, how quick and easy that is using test data. And then I could say, great, let's go ahead and click on login. So you can be doing this within sort of minutes of getting started. Of course, if you've obviously first set up your test data. Now that's great doing it in the UI, but another strategy to this is actually to say that if you have the ability to firstly, understand how to use APIs, if the application, the system under test has APIs, as Salesforce does, then we enable you to come in and set up API calls. So we have an API manager where I could say, I want to do my token call. I want to do my create accounts, create opportunity, could be the delete account, delete opportunities. I can basically set up my API calls. I can use, as you can see, variables here. So these will pull in from a combination of test data, environment data, where I've got things like my secret key, but then I've also got my test data, which could have things like the account names and so on. But the point then is, instead of in your test having to, let's say, create an account using the UI, I could come in and say, well, I'm still going to log in. So I'm going to come in and log into my Salesforce instance and come into through the UI to get logged in. But actually then what I'm going to do is say, when I come to my data setup, I'm going to leverage those APIs. So I could make my token call and store the token generated so that now I could use that to pass into my next API call to authorize, but also use test data to be able to set up and create my account through the API. Using that account, I could then come in and then create my opportunity, where you can see at the bit where as we make those calls, we're asserting the response, means that we get a successful status that yes, it's been created. And here we're actually storing the record ID that was created as well from that API call. What this means is instead of having to script out all of those steps to create the account and opportunity, even where that doesn't actually form part of the test, maybe your test is just to change the status of the opportunity, you're reducing down all of those steps so that now maybe all I'm doing in the UI are those steps pertinent to maybe the searching and changing the status of that opportunity. Then at the end of my test, I could leverage API calls to be able to delete the data using the opportunity IDs and the tokens, that stored data. So I know that I'm setting up, utilizing, and then cleaning down the data in a very efficient means. Doesn't mean you have to do it this way. Doing it in the UI is just fine, especially since Virtuoso makes it really quick and easy. But if, again, where you have that capability to leverage and use API calls, fantastic. So, a bit of a whirlwind tour here. And obviously, we haven't got into things like sort of executing tests or being able to then report or how you can hook it into CI/CD or Virtuoso's machine learning self-healing to reduce down maintenance. This was really an illustration of how you can use different test data strategies, which help resolve some of those issues that Ryan highlighted. And on that, since I just, used your name in great light, Ryan, I'm going to hand back to yourself to say, where do we go from here?
We get the screen share, the video on and unmuted, and say that we're here for any questions that you have. Please do pop them in the Q&A section. I do have one already here. Let me have a read of it again. So yeah, really like the random data. For large scale testing of Oracle, is that going to be sufficient to just use the random data?
It really depends because, of course, if you're talking Oracle, there's going to be a combination of sort of generic data. I mean, first names, last names. If you're creating, let's say, accounts or company names, I mean, those can be generic. That's really suited for fake data. But then if you're talking system values, so values in dropdowns, then really that's probably where you're going to leverage test data, where you're going to define what the system value is you want to be able to pick. So probably what that highlights is all of this becomes a test data strategy, which probably it's a combination of methods depending on the type of data that you're wanting to utilize. So yeah, it will help in part, but then also you're going to have to consider there are system values which you really couldn't generate randomly, or at least through Faker.
What kind of browser did you have there when you were authoring tests?
That's so you saw a headless Chrome browser. So in Virtuoso, we run on a headless Chromium, but then we do also have the ability to enable you to do cross-browser testing. So all the latest operating systems and browsers. Typically, we find people run the most of their tests on the headless Chrome and then maybe do a subset towards the end to do cross-browser testing.
Excellent. And then we've got no more questions. We've got a couple of thank yous. That it was a worthwhile webinar. That's excellent news to hear. And I believe we're actually about 15 seconds overrun, but we did start a minute late just to give people time to arrive. So it just remains for me to thank everybody for joining. We know it's difficult and there's a lot of competition for webinars, but we hope it's worthwhile and that we're trying to kind of lead thought rather than just sell. And thank James for his excellent demonstration.
And thank you for your excellent comparing as ever, Ryan.
Wonderful. So all it is me say ciao, ciao for now. Ciao, ciao.